Ryan with Fab9 Tuning. Today I want to answer a couple of questions that I get all the time. Why do I need a Boundary Engineering billet oil pump, and which one do I get? The other one is, how many shims do I need? So we're going to take a look down here. You'll see the two different versions. There's a stage 1 and a stage 2. Now typically on the stage 2, you're always going to see the CNC scribed identifying features here. You've got a serial number up here. The stage 1s don't always have that. Sometimes you will see that, but this one, for demonstration purposes, doesn't have that. So why would you choose a stage 1 or a stage 2? So the stage 1 is good for typically your naturally aspirated guy who doesn't have a lot of parasitic draws on his oil system, but he does want to have a solid gear. And the concept here is they remove this back plate, they machine a billet gear to replace your factory one in here, and that helps with poor harmonics. So these engines typically have really poor harmonics from the factory, which is completely fine because they're not responsible for making much power. But what happens is you start producing more power, you start revving higher, change your engine internals, the harmonics go all out of whack, and your factory damper, your factory balance pulley cannot keep up with that, and it will actually explode the factory gear. Now, you probably understand well enough that if this gear explodes, it's probably taking your engine with it. So we don't want to do that. So this billet gear is going to stop that from happening. It's not going to be a huge performance gain on the stage 1 unit, but it's going to be an added security that you need there. So that's your application for the stage 1. Your stage 2 is actually a machined housing. So visually this looks the same, dimensionally they're the same, but on this backside, when they open this up, they machine this housing out to fit a larger gear. And what that does is increases the volume of oil that you're able to use. And the reason you want to do something like that is when you've got parasitic items on your engine, such as a VVT setup, which is all hydraulically controlled by your engine oil. Or when you're using one of our oil cooler kits, especially this big 25-row set trap, you want to make sure you've got an oil supply to support that. Other parasitic draws are turbochargers, anything that's oil cooled. If you've got, any type of additional items that require flow of oil, it's going to reduce the amount of oil pressure this is going to be able to support. On the topic of pressure, that's where your shims come into play. So if you look down here, you can actually see the relief valve down here. And what this is responsible for is your oil pressure. So again, an oil cooler, an oil-cooled turbo, or your VVT cylinder head is going to be parasitic on your oil pressure. So say you've got 72 psi at your oil pump. That doesn't mean that your engine is receiving 72 psi of oil pressure. Once it runs through here, once it runs through your VVT cylinder head, once it runs through your oil-cooled turbo, it's going to drop that pressure down to potentially a dangerous level, and that's when you want to throw additional shims in here. So usually I say if you've got an oil cooler, run 2 shims. If you've got an oil cooler and a turbo, run 3 shims. If you've got an oil cooler, a turbo, and VVT, run something like 4 shims. And it's going to keep that peak pressure up. So you also should monitor this beyond that. Those are guidelines to go off of, but I would definitely monitor your oil pressure beyond that. On the topic of poor engine harmonics and why we need these, it's probably a good idea to mention an ATi damper. So an ATi damper is going to essentially fight what we're trying to avoid here. This is going to help with engine harmonics, and I'd say if you're building something relatively serious, it might be a good idea to go with both systems, but they're both just fail-safe units. So if you guys have any more questions about these, leave me a comment, shoot us an email. You can use the contact page, and let us know if you have any more questions.